and pull up the presentation. So this evening, our program is going to be Clues, Craft, and Cookery, Reconstructing a 1739 Kitchen. As I said, I'm Laura Adie, and Tony Shahan is here as well. To start with, I know a lot of you are familiar with Newlin Grist Mill, but some have come from the digital realm, so may not be familiar with the site. But the site, the main feature is the 1704 grist mill on the property, and it is the centerpiece of a 160-acre park with over 8 miles of trails. Currently, we are closed to the public, not only because of the pandemic, but also due to damage from back-to-back flooding in August that we are still in the process of recovering from. But the Trimble House that we're going to be talking about is actually behind the mill in this picture and uphill, so it luckily didn't have any issues with the flood. But the Trimble House itself, oh wow, I don't know how that got on the screen. The Trimble House is a house that was built for the Trimble family who came to Pennsylvania from Ireland in 1719. And let's see if I can erase whatever I did to the screen there. I don't know how that happened. Oh dear. Nope, that made it worse. Okay, the Trimbles came here, purchased 50 acres of property adjoining the grist mill. We think that William Trimble may have actually worked for the Newlins at some point. He also owned mills later on, and in 1739 started building his house. So the original part of the house, how is this? The original part of the house you can see here. Then in 1742, they added another story on top. 1750 added a section on the west side of the house. And in the 1780s or 90s, added on another addition at the west end. In the 1920s or 30s, a porch addition was put on that was later removed. So we're going to be focusing on the kitchen and pantry that are in the basement of the original section of the house. Let's see. And we also have a mystery opening that Tony will be mentioning later, and that will give you an idea of where that is. I'm going to try to back out of the screen share and try to re-up it and see if the weird lines on my PowerPoint disappear. Sorry for that. Let's try this again.
Well, it's not a good video program without a little bit of technical glitch.
Yeah, all right. There we go. All right. So this is the other side of the Trimble House, and you can see the walkout basement. So that was part of the 1739 portion, and the kitchen and pantry are what we're going to be focusing on tonight. So the goals of restoring the 1739 kitchen and pantry of the Trimble House were multiple and interlocking. For one, we have been using an outdoor hearth to do cooking demonstrations, workshops, educational programs. And while that has been very helpful to have, it loses a lot of context without having the rest of the kitchen. It's also kind of awkward, and you have weather to contend with. We have a reconstructed bake oven that's also freestanding outdoors that we've been able to utilize in some of our cooking experimental archaeology, working with different types of leavenings, baking shipbread. But again, you don't have a context of the full kitchen and are limited with the changing and infrequently or frequently problematic weather to work with. So we have been using the kitchen at the Trimble House even on a small scale to do some of our programs, including beer brewing. And really the idea is to have not only a space to work from, to do programs from, but also to really get a sense of what the whole site would have been like in the early to mid 18th century, and not just the kitchen itself, but the outbuildings that were there. Some of them are still there today, some of them are only ruins, some of them are archaeological sites waiting to be discovered, and seeing how the domestic life of the household works throughout seasons, whether it's brewing, dairying, how laundry would have been done throughout the year, preservation of foods, and that we can really have a working space to do that from. I don't want to get too much ahead of ourselves though, because first we have to talk about the restoration of the space, and I'll turn it over to Tony to talk about that.
Thank you, Laura. During the restoration of the Trimble House, which was approximately 5 to 6 year project, we have discovered throughout the building that hidden evidence was everywhere in little bitty pieces. And so when we started in on the kitchen project, one of the first things we decided on was to document everything, which meant that we did all of our own demolition work and prep for our contractors rather than leaving it up to our contractors to bring things to our attention or looking over their shoulders constantly. We documented and mapped everything, and I want to throw in a plug thanking Mike Bowner, Keith Doms, and Gabe Christie for all the work that went into not only the demolition, but also making sure that this documentation got done. So when we started, the kitchen was actually covered in this wire and plaster coating. We suspected that there was stuff underneath, but in reality, we weren't sure. It was made to look pretty for the basement of the previous owner. What you have to realize is right above the hearth beam, there was a stairway that punched through the chimney on the second floor, and on the third floor, a hallway went through it. So we really weren't sure that anything existed other than this hearth. So we started stripping everything out. Can you, next slide, please? And this is what we found. There's a whole lot there, and we'll try to unpack some of it. Go ahead, Laura. First thing is the opening on the left had always been argued back and forth. Was it really a window or was it an oven? And we started digging into it, and we showed that it was in fact a window, and this is a window hearth, as some of the few in southeastern Pennsylvania that exist. I think there's 13 or 14 of them that I know of that survived. So the window was there. Next, go ahead, Laura. We had the window seat intact with the actual board still there. Next. One of the most critical discoveries, and kind of one that we didn't spend a lot of attention on initially, was this particular patch. And what it proved to be is an opening for a stove that was inserted from the 1750 edition. And what that means, we know now, but we hadn't pieced it all together at the time, is that this hearth actually only had an operating life as a cooking hearth for about somewhere between 11 and 15 years. So the evidence of a hearth that we have here working is all early. Next. And the final piece that we uncovered was another big patch for a stairway that was punched through this wall that connected the 1750 basement with this room. Next. Here's a close-up on that window and hearth seat. Some real interesting pieces. People have, as I said earlier, thought that this was an oven, but as we dug further into it and actually removed the frame, we found all the original molds in the masonry for the wings of the window frame. So we knew it was a window rather than an oven. And later we found evidence of what we think is the oven. The window seat, however, while it's not absolutely terribly unusual, having it this intact is. But the one thing that I keep questioning about all this that makes me wonder about how it was built is that window seat actually runs all the way through the masonry. You see in the photo on the right, and comes out flush with the outside of the masonry. And I'm not sure if that means that there was an addition or it's just the way they built it in to make sure the seat didn't shift. I'm going to go ahead and answer this quickly while we're here, Laura. There's a question that just popped up about what's the purpose of the window. And that is, believe it or not, it gives incredible ventilation. When we fire up this fireplace, we had just to plug this up because there's a basement next door now, but we had to almost nail stuff down because of the draw that the chimney has. So it really is helpful in clearing out and regulating the smoke in this room. Okay, next. Also above the hearth beam, we actually found evidence of a pot rack or a lug pole. It's the piece on the right. If you look at the very top of that hearth, it's a cross member that you hang pots off of. They were oftentimes wood. A few of them were metal. We know that they were wood because of the newspaper article that talks about the two people that were, well, one was killed and one was severely scalded when one of these wooden pot racks burnt almost through and collapsed. And the pot fell and obviously poured its contents all over the people. With this, we only found the one because the other side had been punched through that matched this. But with it, we understood that there was a stone crane or a crane on one side and this on the other to completely cover and use the maximum amount of this hearth. What we've done is we moved over a few inches and cut another one in, and our blacksmiths right now are making a iron one for us because we don't want to risk injury. But this way we can have one, use it, but we've also left the original feature intact. Part of what we've tried to do and work really hard at is preserving as much of this in perpetuity as possible. Next. As I mentioned earlier, the brick dark line that you see actually right where the cursor is actually a series of fragments of brick. Most of that was removed and eliminated when they put that oven in, but there are a few cut brick that are shown up in an arc in a straight line. So that's where we think the oven was at. As we were doing the repairs, though, we went ahead and we pulled out a bunch of fire damaged stone to rebuild it. And a couple things in that are really important here. First of all, this is a fireplace that had only been in operation for 11 to 15 years, and it has severely damaged stone, but it also has damaged stone that's already been repaired at least once, if not more times. And the more we dug into it, we realized that they're not just surfacing their fireplaces. In many cases, we find evidence of them doing masonry work on these every year to keep them in full repair. So we got worried when we spalled off stone off of ours the first couple times we used it. And now we're realizing that this was actually the way these were being used. The other thing about that is the stones that we pulled out, there were several fragments of soapstone in there. and two of the larger pieces actually had tool marks on them. One of them looked like it had iron tool marks. The other one looked like it had antler tool marks on it. And we brought in some prehistoric archaeologists, and they are guessing that these came out of a quarry that was local, that they had been quarried prehistorically and started working on and then discarded, and then picked up in the 18th century and used as a repair stone. So this is the level of depth that we're finding in the features in this building. Next. As we pulled up the floor, the biggest surprise was that we found fragments of the hearth. The bigger surprise was that they're actually still plastered or mortared to the original bedrock, which is also sticking up there. Bedrock seems to have been a feature on our site. We knew it was around the Miller's house, but apparently even at the top of the hill, they continue. Next slide. There we go. And you can see here we have a ledge of it that runs through the middle of the kitchen. And those three peaks have all been lowered. The middle one was lowered mechanically, probably using something like a sledgehammer to beat it and pulverize it. The two outer ones actually show signs of fire cracking, where they heated up those stones and poured water on them to shatter them. And you can still see some of the charcoal around them in the soils. Next. The discoveries just continue, though, as we continued upward. We went to the second floor, and that hallway that punched through the chimney from the original structure to the 1750 addition, as we started knocking out the stone walls to replace and put back the fireplace, what we found was the original smoke chamber intact. They had just actually laid stone down, or excuse me, laid plank down over the top of the hearth beam and into the stone wall, and built stone walls off of those to make these hallway walls, leaving everything behind them intact. And this is original plaster, clay plaster lining in this mortar. Next. The next floor up, where a hallway had been cut through, as we pulled the walls off, we found more of this clay plaster. And in it, if you look at the image on the right-hand side, you can see the curved edges where it was delineating corners for this. So we know pretty much the configuration and shape that hearth actually took. What's interesting is, if you look at the image on the left, the wooden structure in the upper right-hand side, just below that, you can see another one where a second-story corner had been a secondary flue that came up and fed into this one. So it was a fairly complex construction. Next. In that mortar, though, on the third floor, we found evidence of people. In the left-hand image, you see all the dimples. Those are actually fingerprints. And you can see the fingernails in those prints as well. And it looks like the mason was going through and tapping it to see if it was dry yet. So we were able to recover a fragment of those, preserve them. We coated them with a polyethylene glycol mixture to consolidate the clay and the creosote and all the soot that had built up on top of them as well, because that was starting to flake off. So we were trying really hard to coat this. And now we have a beautiful piece of evidence for one of the craftsmen that helped build this house. Next. On the other side of the kitchen, we found 3 nail blocks and a hole for the 4th. Okay, Laura? Next. You can see the 2 blocks on the left, and then the 3rd one was where a hole was. We believe these were actually attachments for a sink. If you look at the slight taper that these make would be perfect for any kind of a sink where everything's draining to one end. We also found other evidence because we went through and looked at the walls next. And there was a vertical line that was something between a mortar line and a paint line. We never could quite identify it, but it was distinguishable. So we marked it out, and we think it was probably either a corner cabinet or a shelving unit of some sort that was in there, post-dating this sink, obviously. Next. One of the big mysteries we've always had in this kitchen was, if you look in the ceiling on the image on the left, there is a small iron beam. If you look at it closely, you'll realize that it's actually an elevator shaft out of a mill elevator. It was not built in this part of the building, doesn't belong here. We always wondered why it got there. Well, as we started working in the floor, if you look at the image on the right, you can see we found a drain, mostly made with late 19th, early 20th century materials. And it didn't make a lot of sense until we were visited during this project by a family member of one of the families that lived in this house. And we found out that they ran a smoked meat business out of this house. And this was their abattoir. And that shaft was put in there as a place to hang carcasses to skin them out and reduce them down. Next. If we move into the pantry, we have more and more challenges. You see the bedrock is still continuing through the wall. It comes into the middle of the floor. We have more walls or doors punched through walls. We have another window, and that was rebuilt based again on molds from the frame wings. We were able to determine exactly how big it was and able to put that back in. This particular room also had a modern I-beam in it that we needed to replace, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But one of our big surprises is in the left-hand corner. You can't really see it in this image. Next photo or next slide. You see there's another door facing to the east side. This has been a real mystery, and it took everything we had to not dive into this and investigate it, but decided to do it from an external excavation at a later time. Because what we found is when we punched through this with a probe, that wall is only about 6 to 8 inches thick. And it seems to be all earth on the other side. So we were really afraid to start tearing it out for the hazards of what would happen with the basement filling up with dirt. At the bottom of that, we also found a fragment of floor, stone floor still intact. Next. At the heart of everything that we've done, and just kind of pull together some of what we've said already, is the documentation. And this is another great example. When we went into this room originally, it had a concrete floor. And this area over the bedrock, they had decided to deal with in the 20th century by just forming it up, and they poured a concrete slab over the top of this to clear it. Actually had an oil tank sitting on top of that slab when I first got here. And as we started digging it out, we were somewhat confused at first, and thank goodness did the level of documentation that we did. But you can see in between the stones, various pieces of white. Those are actually not concrete. What we found out is there's a series of mortar patches that appear to be different materials, probably different dates, that they tried to fill in and level out the openings between the stones. And they appear to have done this multiple times because we actually have archaeological deposits in between some of these layers. We pulled case bottle out, or pieces of a case bottle. We pulled bone, some ceramic. So there was not a lot of artifact, but there was a little bit to show evidence of use in here. We would have not been able to pick that up if we hadn't documented every step. Next. And I just wanted to throw this in because the polished peaks out in the floor in this bedrock showed us and were in line with that floor fragment to tell us that this was probably the original floor. The other thing that was always a lesson is because it was concrete floor, we busted out one small section and did an archaeological test. And we did that right in front of the door. If you look over that deep part right in front of the door, that's where we tested archaeologically. There was not a single thing there, and we didn't anticipate finding anything. If we'd have moved that in either direction by 6 inches, we would have hit bedrock and other stone. So archaeological planning is very, very important. Next, please. When it came to the I-beam, it was equally a challenge because we got the log, we hired a ewer, and he had a heart attack. And we waited for him to heal up, and he had another heart attack. And we started running out of time, so we decided that in the line of what we do normally with experimental approach to history, we decided to use the log ourselves, and it turned into quite a learning experience for us. Next. It went well. We had our tools. We had our felling axe and a broad axe. We took the felling axe in and made the notches. Next. Then split everything out, just kept working down, and actually made a team where Gabe was notching and I was actually using the broad axe to remove the flats. Next. And we started getting our square sides. Just kind of shows the process of it. Next. And the broad axe proved to be quite a tool. I had not used one as much as I had always wanted to. And while I felt it at the end of the day, I have a greater respect for somebody who can peel back a log in a straight line. Next. The final product came out just as we had planned. It went into the kitchen, jacked it up. The masons came in and repaired it. But that wasn't the end of our woodwork. We also had to do door frames and doors. So for those, next slide, we actually utilized our reconstructed millwright shop. Using period tools and techniques, we actually built all the components in this kitchen during the restoration as much as we possibly could. Okay, Laura?
All right. So then it's up to actually furnishing out the space. And with that, we had to rely on a variety of sources, some of them written. So inventories, probate inventories, and account books. We have transcripts of Newlin and Trimble probate inventories starting in 1729 and going to 1772. But the 1772 one is the only Trimble inventory we have. So as Tony said, the kitchen that we're talking about was out of use as their regular day-to-day kitchen by that time. And so, it's not going to line up exactly. And, some inventories are very vague. They don't always group things together by room. Even if they don't always say what room they are in. They're not comprehensive. A lot of things get left out, especially those small things in a kitchen that would get used up, worn out, that wouldn't be of enough value to bother writing down on an inventory. And our vocabulary doesn't always match up with theirs. Depending on who's taking an inventory, they might call, one thing a pot, another thing a kettle. Is it what we would call a pot? Is it what we would call a kettle today? And obviously you don't know what any of these items look like. They tend to be fairly low on descriptors and adjectives in it other than old or broken or new. And then as far as account books, we don't have any for the site, but one that I came across is at Yale University and is part of their digital collection. So you can actually digitally flip through every page of a cook's book from Hardwick House, which was a manor house outside of London. And while it's a higher class than what we're interpreting, it does have a really good kind of day-to-day capturing all those little bits and bobs that get used in a kitchen, and things like, you know, buying flour, buying lemons, buying butter, paying somebody for washing, that kind of thing. We also have newspaper advertisements and trade cards to go off of. The trade cards tend to primarily be coming from London, but they often illustrate the types of goods that the person was selling. So this is a Smith ironmonger and brazier business, and you can see all the items that they have very carefully illustrated here as part of their wares. And many of those wares produced or brought into London then came over to the colonies. And by looking at the Pennsylvania Gazette, you can see a lot of the things that were available in our area during this time period. So you've got all of these household goods being offered for sale in Philadelphia at the time, and also being made in the colonies as well. You've got illustrations, satirical prints became much more common in the later part of the 18th century. Mull Handy here on the left is one of my favorites, and is an outlier in that this one dates from the 1740s. And it shows she is made out of kitchen implements, and it has a lot of the small stuff that does tend to get left off inventories, left out of other images, things like scrub brushes, mops, matches. She's holding matches in her hand, and they're conveniently numbered and labeled, which is really helpful when you're researching. Street cry pictures of street vendors. So the cries of London, there's cries of Dublin, cries of Paris. These started in the later part of the medieval, early modern period, but became really common as engravings and prints in the 18th century, and you see them up through the early part of the 19th century as well. This particular one is by Paul Sandby and shows a vendor of brushes and mops. So you see some of these goods in the context of being offered for sale. As far as what the kitchen itself looked like, cookbook frontispieces were pretty typical as the kind of illustration on facing the title page of printed cookbooks. Again, these are showing bigger manor house kitchens, so they tend to be grand and often idealized as far as the tidiness and the setup. But it gives you a good sense of what someone of the time would have expected a proper kitchen to look like and how it should be arranged. And then other art illustrations, another Paul Sandby image. This is Sandpit Gate Kitchen. He did a series of images at Sandpit Gate, and this one in particular shows kind of just what was happening on an average day in the kitchen. You see a guy pumping water, not again, very wealthy household with a large, well-appointed kitchen, but some of the details show you what the kitchen would have been functioning, how it would have been functioning on an everyday basis. And then paintings like this Zoffany painting of the Farmer's Return do show a more of a middle class, middling sort. Notice though that all of these are English sources. And of course there are European images as well, but from the influence that would have been at the Trimble and the Newlin households, the English sources are going to be more reflective of what their culture would look like. We just don't have much in the way of American images from this time period. And so even there's small things like at the hearth, they'd already in England started burning coal. And so you see a coal grate where our hearth is not going to be raised with that grate. They're going to be still burning wood, mainly on the floor level hearth. So there are limitations on these. You also have existing artifacts. And at Newlin, we're lucky in that we have a archaeology program that we're able to pull from to help us know what is appropriate for the site. Unfortunately, the bulk of the artifacts that we have excavated have not been from the time period that we interpret. They tend to be late 19th, early 20th century, especially things that are associated with one of the Trimble outbuildings. But we have found some 18th century pieces. Another limitation with archaeology is that they're often just small fragments. The agate ware piece here is actually only about a centimeter at its largest dimension, but we have found examples of different types of, tin glazed ceramics, Philadelphia redware, a bone-handled knife. We found some glassware as well that can help us establish what would have been on site. There are a few pieces in our collection that we've drawn on as well. This rolling pin actually has Newlin family provenance, so it was handed down through many generations of the family. It was recorded on the little tag, and we've had a wood turner make us reproductions of these that we can then use in the kitchen. But we have a limited collection, and so in doing research, finding things that are appropriate for the site and to document those and draw from on what we need to find for reproduction items to furnish the kitchen with. Thankfully, online collections catalogs are now a thing, and it's much, much easier to search for and find and get really good high resolution photos of things and dimensions and multiple angles and such, but going into the collections of Winterthur, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the British Museum, Colonial Williamsburg, and even looking at auction house sites that specialize in American decorative arts, also some private collections that people have made available with research. All of those have helped too. Though with the extant artifacts that are in museums, it does tend to be somewhat limiting because the things that survive are not always the things that are the most common. And they often are the things that would have been owned by wealthier people and tend to be more decorative. So you really have to take all of these sources together and use them holistically to get a picture of what should be in this kitchen that we are attempting to recreate. So in doing that, we have to find the artifacts or find somebody who can make reproductions of those artifacts. And we have gone all over the place to do that. This is just a sampling of where our tradesmen, artisans, and vendors are located throughout not only the United States, but also the world. And a lot of these are things that are reproduced for museums, for historic sites, for reenactors, for living historians, though there are some things that are just still made today and are very similar, if not identical to what was around then. You notice the star on Sweden. They still make birch whisks for the kitchen that are pretty much identical to historic ones. I'll turn it back over to Tony to talk for a moment about one of the trades that we have been working with.
I was fortunate enough to work with the pewters, and you see this is a majority of our collection of pewter that we obtained for furnishing the kitchen. And the pewter is actually a great piece to talk about because it shows at the heart of what we're doing. It's not just about fabricating the pieces and acquiring them. It's about understanding how they were made, understanding the trades, and getting to know and documenting the people who are making them as well. This is actually Sam Williams from A.E. Williams Company. He's the latest generation of a company that's been in business since 1779. They're pewters up in Birmingham, England. Next. Their company is probably best known by the public because they made a lot of the pewter for Game of Thrones and some of the other publications, or video and film. But they also make some of the most top-notch museum replicas and make pewter for international export of all kinds, from one-off sculpture to pewter jewelry and everything else for gift shops, to collectibles. But from a historic standpoint, this company has one of, if not the largest collection of bronze pewter molds anywhere in Europe. The image on the left represents about a third of their collection. And since I took and was there last, they have acquired a complete other collection of molds from a German pewterer. So they've expanded out even further, which what makes this significant is when we're ordering a piece, we're actually not ordering a reproduction. We're ordering a modern version of what was originally made, because these are identical molds. Some of these molds actually have 17th century dates on them. So these are the molds that the pieces we're seeing in museums were made from. Next. I was given the privilege of actually going in and working with these guys on an afternoon and documenting what they were doing. And they were making goblets. These are actually pewter goblets. But some of the tricks that you learn from doing these things, this is actually Stephen Johnson, who's Sam's uncle. But these molds, the larger they are, the longer they take to prepare. A big charger mold like we had made for a couple, or used for a couple of our pieces that we ordered, literally took 6 hours in the fire to get them warm enough to be able to cast. So if you can imagine, you're 6 to 8 hours in preparing a mold, and you're not going to set and make just one. You're going to be doing as many as you can after that. So these guys are dedicated. The other neat thing about their shop is above all of their motorized equipment are all the drive pulleys for the original drivers of these machines that they're using. Next, please. This is what is the difference between most of the pewter that we see today and made in the States and what is made by the high-end pewters, is that they take the time to finish it. First step is to go in and actually turn it on a lathe and remove all of the molding marks. Then they take a special burnishing tool and polish it down. It's one of the most interesting things about pewter is it will move. You can actually fill in holes by burnishing pewter and make it move and fill in gaps. And in fact, David Williams over here on the left is putting a finger notch into that goblet, and he does it by turning the handle of his tool around and pushing against the pewter just lightly, and it's literally shaping that pewter to where it needs to go. This is also what the difference between how you tell the difference between pewters, because it was at this point that they would put little decorative rings and such in to identify it as one of their pieces. Pewters, whether they were in England, Germany, or the United States, always had basically the same molds. And they figured out different ways of making it their own and making it a regional piece. Next, please. And then depending on the time period and all, you would buff it and polish it to finish it out. But the pieces on the right are some ink wells that they made for us. And they basically made them from goblets to show you how it's made. The goblet is actually not a cast piece as we think of it. It's done in several pieces and soldered together. So to make the inkwell on the left, which is an early Philadelphia inkwell, it's got provenance to the region, so we had them replicate one. They took that mold on the left and cast the cup. They turned off the little ring at the top, pushed on it and made it go in and gave it a little bit of a slant, cut the bottom base off and turned it upside down and drilled a hole in it and soldered it on. And they had an inkwell, all made out of the same molds. So I find it fascinating how they don't look at this as a goblet. They look at it as a cup mold number 8 with a pedestal number 4, is how they would describe that particular goblet. Go ahead, Laura.
So we've also been working with a number of other tradespeople. Here's another metalwork, but this is tin. These funnels are from hot dip tin out of Virginia, and we were able to send them images and dimensions of what we were looking for that they could then fabricate for us. We also have glassware coming over from the UK that's hand blown. We've received an order of clear glass, so the tumblers and wine glasses and a decanter. We are still waiting on our glass bottles though, because those are green glass and they can only do green glass once a year because it's such a difficult thing to get the kiln cleaned out after doing a round of that. We are working with several potters. This is SJ Pottery. They are out of Arkansas, and we've worked with them actually to reproduce some of our archaeological pieces. So they've reproduced some of the redware, Philadelphia redware bowls that we're able to use. Marshall Sheets of Danestown Cooperage has made a number of our staved containers. So he's made the measures and equipment that we use for brewing, but is also working on other tubs and buckets for us, as well as having made a butter churn for us. Bonnie Gale of English Willow Basketry is working on some baskets. As you can see, she does traditional styles that match up really well with some of the images that we've found in our research. And David Morris, who's a cabinet maker, just made us a beautiful, beautiful ladder back chair for using in the kitchen. And thankfully it escaped the recent flooding. It was still in the visitor center after being dropped off, and Tony came to its rescue before having to flee the floodwaters and managed to get it up off the floor. So we have that to look forward to. So what is next in this project? We have been slowed down by the pandemic, which has not only kept us off-site, our blacksmiths out of the shop, ward workers out of the millwright shop, but also caused some supply chain issues for getting materials from the vendors that we're working with. And then the floods that the site experienced in August have kind of put some of these projects on the back burner a little bit because we've got window frames that need to be replaced, things that are of immediate concern, but we're hoping to be able to invite people back to the site once this is all finished in place and it's safe to start having people on site again. In the meantime, we do have another Newlin Series virtual program that we have scheduled for October 24th at 2 o'clock, and Mark Meltonville will be joining us from the UK to talk about the brewing projects that he has been involved with here at Newlin. So I will try to drop the link into the chat below, and you can sign up for that if you haven't signed up already. And finally, we'd like to thank the organizations that have sponsored this project, the groups that have been around for helping us with the research, as well as patrons from some of our programs that have funded the project. And Tony, would you like to say anything else to that?
We've got great supporters, but no, a couple things I do want to throw in. We were able to partner with the Winter American Material Culture Program, and their students actually put together an 8-binder set of data for us on early kitchen research, the material culture component that allowed us to track backward some of these things that we found documentary-wise, but try to put shape, size, and material to them. I would also want to make sure that Mark Meltonville and Peter Greers get thanked because we were on the email and on WhatsApp with them quite often going, well, what do they mean by this particular topic? And then the final thing is to make sure that those who have attended our programs before, our tavern nights, other period dinners, and other fundraisers, realize that this is the kind of project that your participation helps support. So thank you all very much. And any questions?
So I've put the link for the next program in the chat, so you should be able to go right to that if you haven't signed up for that one yet. And, oh, thank you. Yep, any questions, feel free to drop them in there while we are still up and awake. All right, well, it doesn't look like anybody has any questions. Clearly, we were so thorough that we answered them all. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again for the October presentation.
Thank you, and we hope to see you back on site soon.
Yes.
Have a good night, everyone.